This week, I talk with artist and writer Michael Kupperman about Tales Designed to Thrizzle and his new book, All the Answers, about his father Joel's struggles with fame as one of the quiz kids in the 1940s and 50s. What pointers did Kupperman take from Grant Morrison's work? What did he do to try to beat other graphic novelists at their own game? Then Kumar and I review All the Answers. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim.
This is Kumar.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Kumar in Melbourne. How are you doing?
Great.
And of course, it's been a million years since we last did this, except it was actually like 2 months ago, probably.
That's not true, is it?
I have no idea when it was. I didn't look it up, and I never.
It's all a blur these days.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this time, we're going to be reviewing All the Answers by Michael Kupperman, which came out during the summer. But before we do that, I've just, yesterday as we're recording this, have done an interview with Michael Kupperman. And we talked about this book and some things about Tales Designed to Thrizzle. I asked him some really deconstructing comicsy type questions about some techniques that he uses in his books and so forth. So here's the interview. Okay, so I'm talking with Michael Kupperman, who is in Brooklyn. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Okay, yeah, good to meet you. Listeners might know Michael's Tales Designed to Thrizzle series, and he has a, pretty new book out. It's been a few months now, called All the Answers, and we're going to talk about all that. But I'm not very familiar with the work you did before Thrizzle. What else did you do before that?
Well, I started doing comics in the early 90s, and it was the era of the zines. So I was in a lot of zines in the 90s, and I did comics for them, and gradually worked my way up to Heavy Metal magazine, and from there got my first book. But I also did illustration for years for a lot of magazines out of New York, especially the New Yorker, Fortune, or the New York Times a lot. I did a lot of illustration until about years ago.
Okay, so the illustration, this was what, to just sort of accent things in a story, in an article?
Yes, it was editorial illustration. There was a lot of illustration in the New Yorker of upcoming events and artistic events and personalities, and there were a lot of editorials in the New York Times that I would illustrate, stuff like that, or business stories in Fortune.
Okay, and then the comics work you were doing then, was that kind of in the same vein as Thrizzle, or what kind of work was that?
Yes, my comics were kind of avant-garde. I'd gone to art school for fine art. I hadn't really studied comics, and I really thought I could bring something new to comics. I started because some people I knew were doing a Xerox zine. This was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 89 or 90. And so I was doing cartoons that were really avant-garde and kind of surreal, and gradually they evolved into things like the Picasso cartoons that were my first successful ones, and then some of the longer vignettes, and that was collected in my first book, Snake and Bacon's Cartoon Cabaret. But yes, it led directly into the Tales Designed to Thrizzle. I would describe it as all kind of Dadaist humor work.
Okay, so Snake and Bacon predate Thrizzle then?
Yes, it does, yeah. Snake and Bacon was my first book. I finished it in 1999, and it came out in 2000.
Wow, okay. What aspects of your work are you happy with, and what do you wish you could do better?
Well, that's a difficult question because part of the answer has to be part of the what I'm disappointed about with my comics is the reception.
Sure.
And I don't know what I could have done to improve that, really.
Well, I know that feeling.
Yeah, I think we all do, really. So it's hard to say. I'm very proud of my work, though, in a lot of ways, because I do feel like the humor work as well as the new book, it really has connected with people in exactly the way I wanted it to.
Mm-hmm.
So for my earlier work, I think it was really about the liberation of art and the liberation of laughter together. I thought, and I still actually think I have done, I could do things in comics that hadn't been done before with humor. I don't know if that kind of humor has broken through in general yet, but I think it's still almost as avant-garde as it was when I started doing it.
Okay.
So I think I've definitely had some successes as far as the reactions that I have gotten to my work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've broken through on a larger level, and that's always frustrating. But on the whole, I'm proud of a lot of what I've done. And then like everyone, every creative person with a long career, I've done a lot of horrible stuff too. But hopefully that's not what I'll be remembered for.
So I have some questions about Thrizzle and other things, but let's get into your new book first. So for people who don't know what All the Answers is about, explain the basic idea.
Well, All the Answers is a book about my father, and it's a book basically where I try to connect with my father by investigating his childhood and what happened to him as a child prodigy on radio and then TV. And not to give too much away, but basically I realized that any connection I could try to make with him was sabotaged by the trauma of his childhood that was never fully acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically what the book's about. But there's a lot in it. His career in early TV and radio. There's anti-Semitism and the war effort, the quiz show scandal. And then, but most of all, I think it's really about fathers and sons.
Sure, yeah, it's personal, but it's also a lot of history, things that everyone would have been aware of at the time. What was the main catalyst for you writing this book?
Well, there were a couple. I wanted to do something serious. I wanted to move out, maybe of humor, into doing something different with narrative. My humorous work was all about subverting the expectations of narrative, and I wanted to fulfill the expectations of narrative instead for a change. And then there was the real fact that, as I started considering this, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and it became, a ticking clock kind of situation where I had a limited amount of time to connect with him, or to extract any information, or to use any information I extracted to pull him back, which is something I genuinely thought I could do, and which turns out not to be possible. So all of those were catalysts. This was clearly, once I committed to it, clearly it was something that had to be completed and couldn't be put off.
Right, you couldn't just set that aside and work on something else. Once you got rolling, yeah. I've had trouble deciding whether to think of this book as a biography of your father or a memoir of your own experience. But why did you decide? Okay, well, I guess you sort of answered that question already. Why did you decide to do this kind of book? Because you wanted to do something different and more serious.
Yeah, but it just also that I realized it couldn't just be a book about him, that I had to include how it had affected his family, and that really meant how it had affected me, which was also something I was coming to grips with as I was doing this, because I think you don't realize until you really start to examine it what kind of, if you'll forgive the phrasing, software your parents installed in you, or which just repeated itself from something that had been installed in them. And until you start to examine that and the effect it's had on you and your decision making, you're blissfully ignorant. But once you start to look at it, it's kind of shocking to realize, oh, I've been doing these things not because they're really the intelligent things to do, but because there were preferences installed in me that say this. And part of this book was realizing that his paranoia about the public and people at large had been transferred to me, that he had put in me some of the qualities that had been installed in him by this trauma of being a child performer. So I had to put myself in the book, but the draft before the final draft had a lot more about me in it, really detailing these effects that his upbringing of me had. I had to pull back because it had become too much about me, and I really wanted the book centrally to be about him.
I see. Yeah, I wondered about that because the book itself doesn't, the final version doesn't really say much specific about what effects it had on you compared to what I'm, even in other interviews I got a little bit more information that wasn't in the book.
Right, because I feel that this situation isn't uncommon, and I felt by really detailing the effects that it had on me, that would in fact kind of limit how relatable it was, because what I wanted to come across was that I was not well equipped to be a man in this society. That's why the book begins the way it does, partly, with that scene at Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. I felt that I had not been brought up to be a completely functioning man in this society, and that's a problem I think is very widespread. Mm-hmm. People lacking the confidence to live their lives. So yeah, there was more about it, but I do feel like it overbalanced the book.
I see. Now, you mentioned elsewhere that one way you prepared to write this book was reading a lot of Grant Morrison, because you found him to be one of the best storytellers in superhero comics. So what were some lessons you took from his work that you applied to this book?
Well, I mean, to be ruthless, I think the biggest thing I did in this book, and there may be qualms you or others have with how much I did it, but was to be reductive and just be ruthless and remove stuff and remove stuff and remove stuff until you had the central story, really. The other thing that I think Grant Morrison does is to be ruthlessly logical. And I think he goes to the center of a premise and then turns it around and makes it work from, I'm losing this thought, but he's just a master at narrative, and he does this through a logical kind of ordering of what is involved in the story. I always find his storytelling very satisfying, partly because it's so well delivered, but also because it's so logical. The beginning and the end, they mirror each other. There's a progression. All the things of classic storytelling, and that's what I tried to bring to my book too, that you would feel like you had traveled a circle.
I see. I wanted to ask you about a couple of sort of techniques that I noticed. Well, in this book, there are a few places, like, for example, the part where Joe Kelly, the host of the Quiz Kids radio show still at the time, he's introducing a boy who is a Holocaust victim. And the panel, there are like 3 panels on a page, and it's kind of the same, sort of camera angle, if you will, every time. But the background is kind of gradually filling in with this sort of cross-hatching pattern. It feels like something is sort of closing in. What was your thought in doing that background? It felt like it was creating some kind of urgency.
Yeah, it's the darkness of the realization coming to America of what has been happening.
I see. Sure.
Okay. That's exactly what it's supposed to be, increasing darkness.
Yeah, and you did that in a few other places too, I think. Also, I noticed in both All the Answers and in Thrizzle, you fairly frequently use silhouette, putting characters in silhouette. There's a place in the last issue of Thrizzle, the story about the scythe. I think it's the last issue, or it's volume 2 anyway, where like any scene involving the Pope, everybody's in silhouette.
Uh-huh.
And in this book, for very different reasons, there are a number of instances of characters in silhouette. What were your thoughts about doing that, or when do you choose to do that?
Well, again, it's when it serves it to make the storytelling as stark and as simple as possible. So I was really trying to hold the visuals down to as simple and readable a flow as possible, and reducing things to silhouette. I felt really put that into kind of stark, simple, readable imagery that also placed the reader at a bit of a remove.
I see. Yeah, it can create some other effects too, like the page. Well, you're heading into the TV section of the story, and you've got your father probably in his late teens at the time, and in the first of the 3 panels he's in silhouette, and then you can see his face in the other 2. It sort of created the effect of like TV studio lights coming on.
Right.
Was that your intention, or?
Yes, and that also, that he was coming forward into public awareness as a TV performer. He was emerging. His face was emerging before America.
I see. I just finished Thrizzle Volume 2, and there's a story in that last issue about the true story of the 1969 moon launch, which I understand you got an Eisner for in 2013.
Incredible.
Yeah. But yeah, I was happy when I found that out because I loved that story. And it reminded me somewhat of Axe Cop because it had that same quality of like a kid, with action figures in hand, sort of making up a story as he goes and abruptly adding, more fantastical elements out of nowhere, like a werewolf or cyborgs. But I was wondering, how on earth does an adult sit down to write a story like this? I mean, Axe Cop was written by a 5-year-old.
Well, it's nice to know I have the same storytelling gift as a 5-year-old. It was that one was actually adapted from a weekly strip, which partly accounts for how kind of shambolic it is. There is an appeal, definitely, to storytelling when you can tell it's been kind of pieced together bit by bit. But no, that I had a lot of jokes on the moon landing, and then I thought of some more while I was writing it, and it kind of proceeded like that. Yeah.
I think generally it's kind of difficult for adults to sort of pull back and get back into that childish or childlike mindset of imagining a story.
But that's a central quality of an artist. In fact, I saw Tadanori Yoku, the famous Japanese poster artist, give a talk some years ago, and he said that to him that was the central thing about being an artist, was preserving the innocence and the spontaneous reactions that one had to the world as a child. So I see myself as almost a sophisticated exterior that's grown around, that same child that's still within me, hopefully. So that's I see myself operating.
I see. So, reading Thrizzle Volume 2, I was thinking about how, and I feel like I've seen it in a lot of other places, and I can't put my finger on any of them, but where like images from 50, 60, 70 years ago, maybe from old advertising or photo libraries or whatever, are used for sort of comic or satirical purposes. And I wanted to get your thoughts about why that technique sort of works and why you choose to use so many kind of mid 20th century looking stuff in Thrizzle.
Well, Thrizzle, it's really about kind of re-examining and disgorging the culture of mid to late 20th century America. The period approximately from the 50s to the 70s. I was born in 66, so I lived 34 years in the 20th century. And I think in many ways I was doing what a lot of people are doing, and still, which is taking apart the culture and the ideas that we were all fed during the 20th century, some of which were terrific and some of which were really deeply flawed. And I think, I think a lot of the writing, especially in Thrizzle, is about repeating the tropes and the ideas of the 20th century, but in an idea which renders their absolute ludicrousness very obvious.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The storytelling and the ideas and the things we were all fed over and over and over, and just how kind of weak and ludicrous they are.
Mm. Yeah, I'm thinking about how much Quincy shows up in Volume 2. And
I know. That was supposed to be in Best American Comics, but I think it's Harcourt Brace were scared to print it and ultimately wouldn't. They were still so scared of getting a lawsuit by the Quincy people. But Quincy that's a great example of that, because I think my parents liked it, or certainly my mother did. And so I was exposed to a lot of it. And so there's a lot of Quincy in my head, despite the fact that, I like Jack Klugman, but I have no great desire to see any of it again. But it's there because I grew up with it. There was this movie I was just talking about on Twitter called Brigsby Bear, which was from a year or two ago, which I thought was really, really interesting because it was about someone who's exposed to this one particular show that his parents make when he's a child, and he's actually released from their custody by the authorities because it turns out they've kidnapped him and his entire existence is fictional. But what he wants to do is to finish the narrative of the TV show they were showing him and to make a movie of it and finish the story. And I thought it was fascinating because what it's saying is that what we're exposed to as children is what will stay with us and what we want to express as adults. I think there's this idea that an adult should be high-minded, but there is going to be certainly a lot of that, bringing back what was in front of your face every day when you were a child. And it usually wasn't, the contents of fine art museums, unless you lived a certain lifestyle.
Right. Well, besides this show, I'm doing a podcast about the 60s Batman show, so
right.
There you go.
No, I mean, and certainly people do. But that's my point. That's what you do. You when you grow up with this stuff, you tend to fixate on what you were, growing up in front of, what you were exposed to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's perfectly normal.
Sure. So the photos that you're drawing on in your art, like, of celebrities like Jack Klugman or from whatever other imagery you're using, how do you get them into the comic? Is it tracing or freehand photo reference or some other process?
I used to do everything freehand, and then at a certain point I surrendered and I did start tracing, yes. So, yes, frequently it is tracing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It just felt like it was, really taking much more time to achieve an effect that would be fairly the same either way.
Are you using computer or is this all on paper?
Generally, I try to stay all on paper. I have slipped into using computer for some or all of it, especially when I was doing a lot of illustration with the fast-paced schedule. But I think it looks better the more of it is done by hand before being fed into the computer. And sometimes that means all of it, or sometimes just most.
Okay. So was all the answers, was that all drawn on paper?
Yes. Every piece of it was drawn. Every piece of that book, except for the barcode, actually, I did by hand, including all the lettering, all the drawing, and all the credits, indicia, all the language on the book cover and everything. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I'm just looking at the back cover here, the pull quotes, and yeah, it does look like it's handwriting.
Yeah. I felt like it makes a difference. It does make a difference.
Yeah, it makes it have a little bit more of a, I don't know, organic feeling.
Well, and it makes it more sincere.
Uh-huh.
It makes something more sincere if it's all done by hand.
Yeah, kind of a warmer feeling.
Yeah.
And you mentioned in another interview that you realized later you'd been putting a lot of stuff from the Quiz Kids era kind of into your earlier work, like Thrizzle. Do you think there's any way that your work on Thrizzle was sort of working through issues from your family life that you then went into directly in all the answers?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. In Snake and Bacon, too, there's some where the kind of anger or emotion from family issues was directly into a piece of humor, so I could, sterilize it.
I see. And I guess Quincy is a minor example, too, since you said your mom loved that show.
Yes, absolutely. That and the Rockford Files.
I see, okay. Besides the images of yourself, the technique for the art and all the answers seems sort of similar to Thrizzle, but to very different ends. Were the processes of making the two books kind of the same, or were there some differences in terms of the art?
Well, Thrizzle was more of an amalgamation of material. So there was a lot of material that was done explicitly for Thrizzle, but then there was also a lot that it was being reused that I had done for various magazines or other publications or whatnot, such as The Believer or occasionally the New Yorker or whatnot. So it was very different because with all the answers, I worked very hard on the form of that to make it intensely readable. So I tried to make the drawing as simple and functional as possible. I wanted the pages to have flow so that the person could read the entire book in a single sitting if they wanted to. And I wanted to avoid that feeling of so often when you open up graphic novels, even I do this as someone who creates them, and you go, you look at the outlay of panels with so many text and things, and it's just draining. I find a lot of novels quite difficult and exhausting to read, and frankly, not many of them are rewarding enough at the end. So I wanted to really push beyond what I'd seen and do something different. So I worked a lot doing different versions. I worked on the layout over and over, first of all, to get the script to where I thought it should be. Then I tinkered with the drawing, but ultimately I decided to draw at a much smaller size ratio than I had previously because, again, I wanted the drawing to be as simple and functional as possible, and I was worried if I got too large, it would start to become over-elaborate in the way I felt my work had sometimes been. And then, actually I did the text and I did the drawings, but I did them separately because the text, to make it clear, had to be larger in size than the drawing. So there was a kind of elaborate, workflow set up for all of this. And it dominated, I would say, a year to a year and a half of my time.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I was sort of interested in how in the later Thrizzle issues you seem to go more towards somewhat like longer stories, where it was like really short things, like one-page things in the earlier ones. But I don't know what do you think caused you to sort of veer towards longer things in the later ones?
Well, again, I wanted to start playing with narrative, and I still want to do. If I continue with comics, I'd like to start doing things that bring these two sides together, the emotion and the humor, and have genuine narrative alongside the silliness. So it's just something I've been wanting to do. I've been reading longer and longer comics and wanting to make longer comics myself.
I see.
To create a world, as some of them do.
So many of us are creating content now of some sort, comics or podcasts or whatever, and it's tough for all of us to find an audience and one who will give us money. Um, I understand you've been doing some work for online publications while you were also working on this book. I'm wondering what's your current thinking about navigating the current sort of media landscape.
It's really gotten brutal for comics. I mean, I just feel like I love the art form, but in terms of being someone who does it, it's gotten worse every year of this century, and it doesn't seem to be better. The conditions are awful. You cannot make money. It's really, it's not good. And the more I work at it, the more I feel like I'm trying to get out of a hole by digging my way downwards. So I think it's likely for myself I'm going to start moving into animation, which is something I haven't really moved towards because I did, I have had projects in comics that I wanted to do, and this book was the last one. And the book dominated the last 5 years for me, so it's been a long time since I really thought about where I am. But I do think now I'll be moving more into animation because you actually can get paid that way, and it's not as completely soul-destroying as doing graphic fiction.
Yeah, I mean there are so many different sort of TV channels now and kind of outlets for that kind of thing that there's maybe increases the possibility of actually getting paid something you can live off of.
Yeah, no, the standards are completely different. No, I'm actually I just started doing something for Adult Swim again, and the way everything works is completely different than doing drawings for hire. I started in the 90s, so I still remember what it was like back then, and it was already dying, but it wasn't what it is now, and what it is like being in a kind of zombie movie where a lot of the people don't realize that they're dead. That's what publishing is like now, Yeah, it's gotten really difficult. The trouble I've had promoting this book and kind of, pushing it along, it's really been shocking to me, actually, how hard.
So you mentioned in another interview that you regretted giving up the pen name that you started out with. Why do you wish you'd stuck with that?
I think my real name was clumpy and awkward. I don't know. It has the virtue of being unique, I guess. There aren't many Kuppermans or Michael Kuppermans in this world. But P. Revest was just so much more anonymous and elegant, and yeah, I do kind of wish I'd stayed with it, but then, I made my choices, and here I am. My son, actually, and my wife she kept her last name, and then with my encouragement, we gave him her last name, because I felt it had been enough already.
Just get rid of that.
Yeah.
I see. So, besides your own book, we've heard a lot of other stories of more recent child stars who had messed up lives. I'm wondering what your feeling is about child stars in general after researching this book.
I think it's a terrible idea. I mean, there must be times where it must just happen. Your child really wants to perform, and they get out there and they're spotted. That has to happen. I know it does. But then most of the time it seems like it's parents pushing their children into it. And it's the worst idea in the world because you're drawing on the bank account labeled their future, when you do that. If you, as I say in the book, if you make a successful child, it's not the same thing as making a successful adult, and frequently it's contradictory. He was actually very lucky because when he was famous was at a very certain time of history. And first of all, it was one where at the height of his fame, all scrap paper was supposed to be recycled for the war effort. And there was little merchandising, again, because of the war. Early radio was not that recorded, and early TV was barely recorded at all. And people were optimistic about the future in that period and the decades afterwards, so there was very little nostalgia. And because of all these factors, he was forgotten until my book, of course. So, I don't think any of that would have been possible now. If he had been famous now, it would follow him, every day for the rest of his life.
Yeah, well, even if it had been 10 or 15 years later, there would have been Joel Kupperman keychains and action figures and all kinds of stuff. But
he would not have been able to get away. It would have been more like the character who some people point out in Magnolia, the Donnie Smith character that William Macy plays, who's very visible and haunted and a complete failure as an adult, the ex-quiz kid.
I see. Okay. So I was going to ask what your next work will be. You say you're working towards animation now.
Well, I am going to be working on animation. There are a couple of things I want to do with books. I mean, frankly, I would love to continue with some of the same material I did in this book. I don't know if that's a possibility. I kind of want to do a book on the Greek gods. And I want to do a career history because, it would be one way of presenting all the work I've done in the last 30 years in context and to explain exactly what that is now, what a career in, illustration and comics actually are now, because I think most people have no idea.
Coming up, Kumar and I review all the answers. Did Michael succeed at what he set out to do with this book? What other potential books do we see hiding in this one? First, don't forget, one way you can help this podcast is by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support.
I'm Batman.
And I'm Robin.
This is Tim.
And this is Paul.
To the Bat Polls! The iTunes reviews are in on To the Bat Polls podcast. A terrific podcast, Rave's Got a Rugrat, that brings review, film analysis, and sociological impact to episode-by-episode musings without ever losing the feeling of two brothers with towels tied around their necks, running through the backyard. Unmissable.
Exquisite.
You've heard the reviews, now try it for yourself. New episodes on the first, third, and fifth Thursdays of the month on iTunes or Stitcher, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com.
Wild!
For nostalgia, analysis, and fun, it's
To the Bat Polls.
Okay, so you've heard the interview now. Kumar has not heard the interview, but of course I have because I did it. But now we're going to talk about the book. So as you've already heard in the interview, this is all the answers. It's very different from Tales Designed to Thrizzle. It's not a humor book at all. It's very interesting. It's historical and also very personal and heart-wrenching in places. I think he really succeeded in what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are a lot of levels and layers. And I actually took a lot of notes and was really struggling to find a way to organize them coming in. Mm-hmm. But I will say it kind of like for a while there, whenever you listen to an interview with Kupperman, it sounded like he was going to quit comics because he always talked about how time consuming it was to produce even a little bit of work. It took so much. It was so time consuming on his part. And I thought eventually we're going to lose him. But he has turned some of his tricks, some of his tics to his advantage. So there are certain things like he draws his father with the same face every panel, except his mouth might be a little bit open or it might be closed. And like that repetition is so perfect. And he draws himself with the same face over and over again. And it totally, it's all about that suppressed emotion. There's no emotion in those faces. Mm-hmm. And it worked perfect with that. And he already had that kind of old-fashioned style almost. And there's some things where the backgrounds are, he's just kind of put patterns in, but sometimes it works like very symbolically, like where his father's running away into a tunnel, which happens on one page. So there's lots of stuff like that was like, stuff that he had developed, I guess, during his time on Thrizzle that really worked to his advantage. There was a shocking moment early in the book where he's at the dinner table, and it's all like on page 15, and he just breaks down and cries for no real reason. But the caption says, "I was lonely and miserable and felt like nothing in my life had worked out. Here I was still trapped with them. I was a total loser." And I was like, wait a second, this is like 2005 or 6 this is happening. So Thrizzle was already coming out. It was like the funniest comic there was. And I'm like, what? I was so upsetting to me that was like, this is what his life was. It was 2000. Oh yeah, I think it is 2005. He says somewhere, but it freaked me out. There was another thing one other thing I wanted to say about the art was, on page 121, there's one of the panels again where he's talking to his father, and he says, "Now that I can see the level of denial, it's incredible. The trauma has become almost invisible to me as a negative shape." But he's the negative shape in the panel, not his father. But it's so simple, like just having that the same repeated shape, it's the same face of the father and him just the negative shape, and having the line which is actually describing the opposite of what's happening in the panel. I thought it was just, there was so much stuff like that was just working really. I was amazed how sharp the writing was throughout. I really was surprised because I thought it was going to be another thing. Well, it's, it reminds you of, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, aren't I?
No, go ahead.
It reminded me of Backdorf's Dahmer book, because we have an established cartoonist doing a thing about a famous person, a book about a famous person, and Bill Griffith just did a book a few years ago about his mother, and it reminds you of Mouse because it's all about these conversations with his father trying to reconstruct the past. So there's all those levels are in it too, but the writing was so. I was amazed. Like reading Thrizzle, you really wouldn't realize that Kupperman had these kind of depths in there. Some of it, because the dialogue is so sparse, but a lot of it is so observant and very precise. Like he says a line early on the same page 15, when his father says, "I'm not bothered by that stuff that happened to me when I was a kid." He says, the line is, "I chose to believe him." I mean, that's so specific. Not I believed him, I chose to believe him. And there's like at the very end, there's a line, page 210. "It happened in the past where every little thing was different and people had mysterious and sometimes self-defeating motives." And there's stuff like that the whole way through the book, and it's so sharp. And I just, I was blown away. I was really not expecting it.
Yeah, he's really aware of his own kind of thoughts, I think, too. Like, in the place where he says, "I would find out a lot about me." I'm sorry, I meant him. Right,
yeah.
Just before it really gets into his father's backstory.
That line is the most on the nose in the whole book.
That's true.
But it was really actually forgivable because it was so sparse. It's just a few words, as it is throughout the book. And somehow, with very little dialogue, and in a sense, very little art as well, has kind of created this whole tapestry of this thing that happened to his father. Now, did you talk about in the interview about the plot of the book? Because I don't know, do we need to go over that?
I don't think we need to. I mean, we think we covered that well enough. But yeah, basically it's about, his dad was doing Quiz Kids as a kid and became famous, but he hated it, and it kind of traumatized him for life and trickled down to his kids. Now, in some of the reviews or recent interviews online talking about this book, they tend to use as the illustration page 77, where young Michael and his dad are in a pool, and Michael says, "Daddy, do you love me?" And his dad says, "Some of the time." And I mean, that's a really heart-wrenching page. But for me, the even more heart-wrenching one was later. And I'm trying to figure out my notes here. 176, where Michael is imagining the conversation that he wished would be the result of putting this book together. And so it's 3 panels. First one, Dad says, the power of that show had been haunting me for so long. You've dispelled it. I feel whole again. Second panel, thank you. Now, that was enough to get across the basic idea. But then, after he sticks in the words, this didn't happen, you've got that third panel with his dad hugging him and saying, you're a good son. And I just feel like crying even talking about it. And, not only did that conversation not happen, but, how often does it happen for any of us? How often do any parents ever say that to their kids?
So I think something else you touched on there is the control of the tempo of the art and the text is really controlled. And I think that's a thing you get from doing comedy too. I think that has carried over from Thrizzle, but used for a completely different effect here. Like the one I noticed was on page 74, where he says the quiz kids didn't seem troubled by all the attention. They seemed to be good friends having amazing adventures together. After it was all over, my dad never talked to any of them again. There were meetups or reunions. He avoided them all. But it's interspersed with these pretty large panels of the kids seemingly having a good time, contradicting what we're getting from the text, where he avoided all these reunions and things. And I felt like that was really controlled throughout, too. And those foreshadowing was amazing, like 4 or 5 times. There's a line where he says, this would lead to something awful. I'm saying it in a ham-fisted way, but then it would be the next chapter where you find out, I'll find some, because I noted some of them down.
I think it's particularly when it's leading into the TV section.
Yeah,
because his father didn't even remember being on TV later because it was such a traumatic experience.
Well,
for
this
him.
is okay. So there's another amazing thing there too, which I'll get back to. But he's about to go on to $64,000 challenge, I believe. And there's on page 152. He's about to go on. He's done an interview, and he's saying, obviously he accepted it. All he needed to do was what he had always done: answer questions. But this time he would make big money. And then the next panel, so we're just closing in on his face. It's the same panel repeated, but closer and closer. And then the next caption is the classic American setup for tragedy. And there's so many little lines of foreshadowing like that through too. And then, and like when he goes away to Europe and he's about to come back, and there's a line where he says, "I wish I could have throttled him and said, 'Don't do it, don't come back.'"
Yeah,
well, you don't know what's happened.
He says, "I wish I could have." Shouted in his stupid face? And I thought, wow, we're kind of showing the anger here.
Yes, yeah. I loved all that stuff too. It was really amazingly tight. It was tight, and it all just pulls you in deeper and deeper. And sometimes he tells you something, and you're like, you don't quite get it, and then it's not until a few pages later that he elucidates it more, and then you realize that some throwaway comments were actually a lot deeper. But it is, so I was going to say something else about the
foreshadowing.
About the challenge. I can't.
The $64,000 challenge part, where just on the very next page after the one you were talking about, there's more foreshadowing where he says in that third panel on 153. So what happened next hurt him, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. So it gets into how he went on this game show, and he was given the answer in kind of a subtle way ahead of time without realizing what was happening until he got on the game show and then realized that he had been given the answer. There's a great thing there, which is very early on in the book, maybe before page 10. You get the only line, so you know that he taught at a university in his adult life. And Kupperman
Michael Kupperman is about to write this book, or he's not even writing the book. He's just trying to find out information about his dad and this game show life he had as a child when he was a child star, which he knows nothing about, almost nothing. He's gotten some drips and drabs from like his grandmother, and he goes in there and he pulls aside all the books his father has written on morality and ethics, which is apparently what he taught at university. And we don't hear anything about this again until page 162, where he was on the show. As they ask the questions, he realizes he's been fed the answers before the show. He goes through with the show anyway, but then he quits. And then the line is, he tried to push the shame down and forget it, but it ate away at him. And he spent the next 50 years thinking about character, ethics, and morality. And it was such a great tie back to that little, what seemed like a throwaway line 150 pages earlier. And you didn't really realize how it's so, it's so deep when you think about it, that this guy spent 50 years writing about this. Because again, he was so affected. The thing that I remembered what I was going to say about it was he is traumatized, but he has suppressed these memories. So he has a conversation with Michael. Joel is telling him many 50 years later. He says, Michael says, okay, so you were fed the answers on the show. And he says, I don't remember. And then Michael says, but that's what you told Grandma. And he's like, okay, if I told her that, then that must be what happened. But this was an event that happened in his adult life. He'd been in university for years. He's got to be like 22 or 23 or something. Mm-hmm. So it's not just childhood memories that he suppressed. Like, I haven't suppressed the memories, I don't think, but I don't really remember a lot of when I was a little kid, like 6 years old, like he was. But this is something that happened when he was an adult, and he's forgotten it. He has told other people about it, and now 50 years later, he can't remember it. That, to me, was really telling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It was interesting to me that just from reading this book, I sort of felt as if I had met adult Joel. I felt like I really had a sense of what it would be like to talk to him.
Yeah.
Even before he becomes goes into the dementia. When he's a little younger and healthier, but just because of how Michael shows really, I think, clearly how his father is always kind of reticent and withdrawn and doesn't say anything forcefully. He's always just kind of he's just sort of used to being told what to do, it seems like, really. I mean, it's not, I don't know that that's ever spelled out, but it's pretty clear that he just knew that he was supposed to. Well, Michael does say he just knew that he was supposed to go on the show and give answer questions, and that was what he always did. There's more than one point in the book where somebody points out something to him that he could easily have done and it just never occurred to him.
Yes.
Like when his fame is, there's backlash now, and all the kids his own age hate him.
In university.
Yeah, in university he's getting bullied all the time.
It's not even high school, he's getting bullied in university.
Yeah, which doesn't happen all that often. And the professor says, why don't you leave the country? It's like this had never occurred to him.
Yeah.
So then, because somebody actually mentioned it, then he did. And there are other places where, even talking about, that he could have communicated better with his own kids, Joel said, nobody suggested it.
Yeah, okay, this is to me what was amazing. That's, as soon as you started talking about that, I immediately thought of that. Mm-hmm. So on page 190, Joel said, the father says, especially since during the period we're talking about, I was out of the picture a lot of the time. He says, it didn't occur to me that I should take a hand in steering you. Basically, it never occurred to me that I should have a particular obligation to develop your opportunities and understanding. I would have had to go back and construct a relationship, and nobody suggested I do that. Michael says, construct a relationship? Joel says, with you. Michael says, no one suggested you should do that. And it's not a question. It ends with a period. Mm. No one suggested you should do that. No one at all. It just didn't occur to me. I'm so sorry. I should have, but I had a lot on my shoulders. He's still a child. Like, he can't think for himself.
Mm-hmm.
Even after having his own child, it never... You're exactly right. It's exactly what you're talking about. He needs to be told what to do. He needs to be steered himself.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of a robot. He's a media construct, really, that almost had no identity, or his identity was completely obliterated, or he had to obliterate his own identity in order to survive. But it's interesting, too, that, like, I loved at the end, where there's the mention about there's a thing about how he suffers from dehydration as an old man because he doesn't drink enough water. And that's, like, something from the show. Like, he had to not drink water so that he didn't have to run to the bathroom.
Yeah, during the show.
Yeah, during the show. That stuff to me was really heartbreaking. And also, that there's a line too that Michael says something about how their lives, even though the show had been suppressed to the point where it was trivia, it trickled through and affected their lives, like even the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a lot of ways, just because of what his father didn't do when Michael was growing up.
Yeah, and there's a very interesting line where he says, like, where Joel says, I felt I was trapped even when there was nothing particular or dishonest. I felt that I was trapped in a role that would make the kind of people I'd really like to know not interested in spending time with me. That, to me, also was a very telling line, because that was the real Joel. Who did the real Joel want to meet as a 6-year-old? Did he want to meet astronauts and scientists? Did he want to meet Einstein or people like that would have thought he was ridiculous because he was on a kids' quiz show? Because we don't hear who those people he would really like to know are. It's just that line.
Mm. Yeah. Michael talks a little bit about how in those days, like we're talking about the 40s and earlier, it was more common to put kids on display for adults' amusement. And he mentions the Dion quintuplets, who had a really horrible existence for the first, 7-8 years of their lives or something, where they were like, on display on a schedule every day. But I kind of wonder how much better it really is nowadays for child stars.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because there's around early on there's some description of so around page 40 and 41. I just love these two pages, because every line could have been a book in itself. So he says, I felt no connection to my grandmother because it seemed clear I wasn't supposed to. She was the one who'd been filling these scrapbooks, obsessively chronicling every detail of the career she planned for Joel. The daughter of immigrants, she wanted to be a dancer, but had given it up to help raise her siblings when their father walked out on them during the Depression. There's another 3 books right there. Mm-hmm. Later, she put that energy into being a tireless stage mother. The phrase child prodigy first appeared in the 1860s attached to the immigrant prepubescent performers featured on urban music hall stages. By the 1920s, there were child prodigies everywhere, prodigies in sports, science, the arts, math. For an immigrant family, a prodigy was an opportunity for advancement, like finding a golden ticket. And it's very interesting there to me that it was tied to immigrant families who had less and it was like a golden, like as he says, a golden ticket to suddenly pull themselves up and out. Because now it's still the fame, people are still chasing fame in America, and it seems like another thing that they've kind of inherited from immigrants from the early 1900s. That culture is still, like, how many song and dance shows are there now where it's like, make it rich, get a record deal, win this contest? You know what I mean? Yeah,
or just put your videos on YouTube and maybe get famous, and like Justin Bieber.
Yeah, and he describes how in the 50s suddenly game shows became the new fever dream of America. Well, now it's a primetime format. Like, it's not, like there's game shows on at 8 p.m. weeknights. It's very interesting how it's completely colored that shape of all that stuff has colored what we're seeing now. And there's a very interesting line from Cowan, the producer, which is the greatest thing TV has to offer is reality, which made me think of reality TV and how staged that is, and how he was talking about reality then, but that was totally staged, phony game shows. There are a lot of, again, powerful parallels that were another, revelation in this book with how great Kupperman was at pulling them together like that and finding them and recognizing them. Yeah.
And by the way, you were talking about pages 40 and 41 and how there were multiple books hiding in there. Well, in the interview, he said that he was wondering if he could maybe get another book out of something from this book, or on this some related topic. And I think maybe those are the pages he should look at.
Right.
He can get something out of there for sure.
Oh yeah, there's so much like history books and just personal history. The mother, which is Michael's grandmother, is a really interesting character because she's a stage mom, really obsessive, and she keeps these notebooks, and that's an amazing thing, because if I was Michael Kupperman, this would have been a very difficult book to put together, not just emotionally, but because the father emotionally distances himself from difficulty and narrative comes from difficulty, that makes constructing a narrative for the book difficult. But fortunately, the mother, who was obsessive about fame and the career, was also obsessive about meticulously keeping these scrapbooks, which allowed the book to exist. And it's another one of those interesting things where you don't know what's happening initially, because you get these epigraphs in front of each chapter, these quotes, and they're kind of pasted up in some book, and you don't really know what that is until chapter 2, and then you realize what you're looking at, or it's like constructed as if it's in a scrapbook. But I did wonder, like, what do we know about Joel, like, again, besides that line I gave, what do we know about the real Joel, and why did he turn out this way and not the other 5 kids or dozens of kids? Because most of them seem to turn out okay, and we hear about this guy, Gerard Darrow, who was a child star who ended up basically self-destructing later in life.
But yeah, you're talking about the other quiz kids. I think most of them didn't stay on the show nearly so long. They kind of grew up and they moved on. But Joel's mom just seemed to want to keep him on there, forever. And so, by the time the show ended, Joel was much older than the other kids who were there.
Yeah. Yeah. There's another interesting throwaway line about how the mom sabotaged every one of his romances. So she never met Joel's wife until the day of the wedding.
Yeah.
There's another book right there, too. Yeah, but I don't think, I don't know if I should say I don't know if missing is the right word, but we don't know why Joel reacted this way. Because the message of the book is childhood fame destroys kids. But really, we only have Joel that gets destroyed and this other child star who's kind of mentioned on one page, Gerard Darrow.
I guess it doesn't necessarily, but it often does. I think it depends on some additional factors. But
I don't think he would be able to get that insight out of him, out of his father, I mean. I don't think it was available. And I don't think, that child persona he was basically destroyed at 5 or 6 years old, or 4 years old, when he became a math genius, a math whiz.
But by the way, you mentioned him, Joel, hiding his girlfriend from his mom until the day they got married. That was sort of an unusually bold move for him. It seems like. I mean, that's some actual taking control of his life there.
Yeah, what is that book? That's another book I want to read.
For maybe the only time in his life, it seems like. Or, well, when he went to the UK to get away from the bullying, that, somebody else mentioned it to him, but, once it was suggested to him, then he decided to do it. So it wasn't that he was without agency entirely, but so much of the time it seemed like he had to be told to do things or he wouldn't do them, or wouldn't think to do them.
Yeah. I feel like my emotional reaction to the book is I feel like he, at 5 or 6 years old, emptied himself. He vacated himself and became a kind of mannequin, a puppet, and allowed whatever his mother wanted him to be kind of take over. And he's a little kind of misbehaving a little bit at age 7, which Michael himself writes is expected of a 7-year-old, but he still kind of went on with it, and then even after university, he came back to it, or tried to come back on $64,000 challenge.
But then I should mention, too, on what I was just talking about, Michael imagines that there had to have been a conversation between Joel and his mom where Joel insisted that he would not continue the show anymore, but there's no record of the conversation.
Yeah.
It's on page 134.
Yeah.
I know it happened, even if he blotted it out from his memory long ago. It happened. It has to have.
Yeah. I'll tell you another interesting reaction I had was I have no idea who this person, who was apparently one of the most famous people in America, was. So, before I read this, I had no idea about Joel Kupperman.
Yeah, neither did I.
Okay, certainly, yeah. Yeah, certainly, even if I had known him, would I have known that he was the father of Michael Kupperman?
No.
Artist of the funniest comic book there ever was, maybe?
Yeah, I'm thinking, that I sort of feel like I might have encountered the idea somewhere of Quiz Kids and Joel Kupperman, but didn't really register in my long-term memory. I don't know.
I know, because there's a panel where you see Rocky and Bullwinkle talk about it.
Yeah.
I must have seen that.
Yeah, because I watched all those when I was kids. When I was a kid, I must have seen it, but it did. I said, "Who's Joel Kupperman?" and moved on.
Yeah, and there's several. I mean, there's a sequence of several pages where he meets Marlene Dietrich and Orson Welles, and then they're invited to give a speech at the first sitting of the UN. How can I not have heard of this? It's amazing. Well, I know how I haven't heard of them. It's just amazing to me the way these things are kind of erased and forgotten. At that level of fame, that they were that famous that he was meeting Marlene Dietrich and Orson Welles and spending time with them. And we have no idea. And he was all on every magazine and in a movie even. And I tried Googling the movie and I couldn't. It's not on YouTube. There's a trailer, but there's no. The movie's gone.
Yeah. Well, we were talking in the interview, and he was saying that his dad was really lucky that this happened when it did, because if it had happened, during the war, all the papers and whatever, were recycled, and there wasn't that much, TV wasn't really a thing yet, and there, because of the war, nobody was making all kinds of tie-in merchandise. Where if it had happened, even 10 years later, let alone now, it would have been a much bigger deal, and nobody could ever forget it, including him.
Right. Interesting. And that makes the scrapbooks more interesting too, because they shouldn't have existed. They should have been destroyed or recycled because of the war. Yeah. And even the whole thing about the theme of answering questions, and I just love how it was about him being a quiz show master, and it was about him being unable to answer any questions
about his own life.
In his own life in later years, he couldn't answer any questions. I love the counterpoint between him being a genius and now having dementia and Alzheimer's and not really being able to answer anything. And another really super powerful thing to me was when he's at this stage, Joel in the present has kind of lost his mind to dementia. Not much of him is left at all. And yet, when the show comes up, there's a troubled look comes over his face, that was so powerful. Like it really was trauma. Like he had been in a war or something.
Yeah.
It had so affected him. I really was very moved by that. That
Mhm.
how much it had affected him, and how little of himself was left through the show, and at the end through the medical condition.
I don't think we have anything bad to say about this book. Do you?
No, it was really surprising. Like I said, even the thing about not knowing who Joel was as a 5-year-old is not, the book is not to blame for that. It is an unanswerable question. It is a powerful, amazing book. I'm very glad that Kupperman did not quit comics, because I thought for sure he was going to. Really, it's just really insightful. There's so many observations in there that are like cutting. Like when he notices in the house, he looks around the house, and the way the house is even, I gotta find it, page 185. So after the fame, he builds this house for himself way out in the country. And it says, living in this house designed to look old, surrounded by old art and old books, my father went inside himself. In many ways, he said no to the future. And that's so insightful, and I just felt like the whole book was like that. There are no wasted words, there are no wasted lines. It's very sparse and exact, and I just thought it was just great.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, he talked in the interview about how he went, did multiple drafts of this and kind of tried to sort of sharpen it down to exactly what needed to be in there and nothing extraneous.
He succeeded.
Yeah, he definitely did.
Yeah.
Although some of the things, I don't remember what it was, but some things that he said he took out, I sort of would have liked to have seen, maybe as a separate book.
Oh,
but.
yeah. There's tons of material in there. I do want to say there's one other thing I wanted to point out, which is on page 138, when he's bullied by these kids at university. It's almost like something out of Animal House or Revenge of the Nerds, that this is happening at university. But they cover him in Heinz ketchup. They cut his tie. They pull off his pants. He's covered in garbage. They throw his shoes out the window. Joel maintains self-control. He says, I'm still in control. And this is, I guess, a regular occurrence. This is a description by one of the bullies that Michael Kupperman found online, apparently. Mm-hmm. But then on the next page, it says, toward the end of his time at the university, a visiting professor said something to him. It was a big moment for my father. He still remembered it and described genuine wonder 60 years later. Joel, why don't you leave the country? But in the panel, he's still got the garbage on him. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it's really, again, it's like the art is working on when it needs to work on a symbolic level, it really does. Like, obviously this didn't happen on the same day, but he's almost drawn as if this is the entirety of his university career in the United States. And I just think the whole book is working with that kind of sharpness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved it. I want to see the other books, but I also want to see more Thrizzle, and I don't know if we ever are.
Yeah, I don't know. It didn't sound like it to me. He was talking about moving into some animation work, but he still wants to do comics when he can also.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd certainly like to see some more from him when he's got the time. All the Answers is published by Gallery 13. Here at deconstructingcomics.com, we produce Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Polls. If you like our shows and want to support them, pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Help us make our next goal and unlock more vintage episodes. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. We'd really appreciate it if you gave us a star rating there and a short review. Even if it's just a sentence, tell the world why you enjoy Deconstructing Comics. Another way to show your appreciation is simply to write to us. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com. and on comiccon.com, where our new episodes usually go up on the Friday before they appear in our feed. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we discussed Part 2 of the Londinium trilogy and our memories of the Mego superhero action figures of the 70s. What's that? Mego action figures are back in 2018? Listen to the Bat Polls in its own podcast feed on Apple Podcasts or other podcast apps, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our bi-weekly spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The next episode will appear next Monday. Then in 2 weeks on this show, Kumar and Dana discuss the new series from Image Comics, Infidel, written by Pornsuk Pishashot, drawn by Aaron Campbell, and with colorist and editor Jose Villarrubia. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.